Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi promotes peace and multilateralism at the United Nations Security Council. Hello, I'm Ahmed, and this is The Heat. How important is multilateralism in solving the world's conflicts and also in promoting economic development? We will hear from the Hungarian Foreign Minister, Peter Szijjarto, later in the show. But first, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi presided over a United Nations Security Council meeting. They discussed the situation in Ukraine and Gaza and how countries can come together to achieve peace. Jody Jacobs has more from the UN.
This is one of China's signature debates for the month of February in its capacity as the president of the Security Council. Addressing the 15-member council on Tuesday, China's foreign minister made it clear that multilateralism and international law should be upheld at all costs.
Members cannot just sit by and watch multilateral institutions become dysfunctional and ineffective due to their own failure to cooperate. The Security Council must rise above narrow-minded geopolitical considerations, champion the spirit of solidarity and cooperation, fulfill its duties conferred by the UN Charter, and effectively play its role for the maintenance of international peace and security.
Tuesday's meeting here in New York comes at a time of significant geopolitical tensions among some major powers, especially following Donald Trump's return to the White House last month. Already the US president has withdrawn and paused critical aid to key UN agencies. Wang Yi says that the time has come to speed up efforts to build a more just and equitable global governance system.
The Security Council was entrusted with authority, and such authority should be upheld by all countries. Any act of bullying, trickery or extortion is a flagrant violation of the basic norms of international relations. Any unilateral sanction that circumvents Security Council authorization lacks legal basis, defies justification and contradicts common sense.
China's top diplomat told council members that China continues to advocate for a political settlement in Ukraine and fully supports all efforts conducive to peace talks. He also added that Gaza and the West Bank are the homeland of the Palestinian people and should not be used as a bargaining chip in political trade-offs. Meanwhile, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, too, called on the Security Council to begin playing a more active and unified role in maintaining peace and security.
I call on members of this Council to overcome the divisions that are blocking effective action for peace. The world looks to you to act in meaningful ways to end conflicts and ease the suffering these wars inflict on innocent people.
While members call for reform and change, much will depend on the Council's permanent members who hold the veto to enact this change. The United States remains critical of the world body and says it is currently conducting a review of its support to the UN and will consider whether the actions of the organization are serving American interests and whether it can be reformed. Jody Jacobs, CGTN, New York.
Okay, it's time to bring in our guests from Beijing. Zoon Ahmed is a research fellow at the Center for China and Globalization. Also from Beijing, Einar Tangen is a senior fellow at the Taihe Institute and chairman of Asian Narratives. Becker joins us from New York. He is the executive director of the Answer Coalition. Welcome to all of you. Zoon, as we are aware, China is a very strong proponent of multilateralism and international cooperation. We heard that from Foreign Minister Wang Yi when he was at the United Nations Security Council. He was defending those concepts very strongly. Why is multilateralism so important to China?
Thank you, Anand, for having me on the show. And of course, one of the things that we have witnessed in China's foreign policy, China's international engagement, is the emphasis on the need for better representation and respecting the agency of an emerging family of nations that was previously considered to be on the margins or the periphery. And of course, we saw that 10 plus years ago, the Belt and Road Initiative was announced with the Global Development Initiative and other civilizations and security initiatives. The emphasis on, again, more equal roles, more equal representation and more respect for the changing dynamics of the world have been at the forefront. So when you ask the question, why is this an important topic, I think a more pertinent aspect of this question is also that the need for respecting how nations can play an increasingly important role is also closely tied with more sustainable solutions. So I think, if we look at the recent trend, we even saw that the focus on true multilateralism has been a central topic in Chinese foreign policy. And this recent, trip by Wang Yi encompasses a series of visits that again emphasize on the need to be more inclusive in our solutions and our approach. So I'll also briefly mention that just a few days ago, he made a speech at the Munich Security Conference, where again, the emphasis was that we need to be respectful of the changing dynamics of the world. And what's even more interesting is that this is exactly what the call in the United Nations Security Council is, with the non-permanent members as well. We see that there is a need to, by Antonio Guterres as well, that we need to respect how there was initially 50 plus members of the United Nations, and today it's 193 members. So how do we ensure that their interests, their perspectives are accounted for? So for China, this has been an ongoing journey. This meeting itself is part of that wave of realization among the world's nations that we need to understand it's not just a few that can make decisions, but rather more solutions need to be accounting for what is the sentiment and what is the growing role of the world. So lastly, I'll also add that when we talk about the global dynamics and multilateralism, it's about true multilateralism, which means we need to take those countries not only as recipients, but as decision makers. And that's where China's various multilateral efforts, whether we talk about the SCO, BRICS, multilateralization of the BRI, which we can later discuss in the program, all of these are closely tied in, and that security and economy are closely interconnected. So this is definitely representative of China's growing call for respect, representation, and justice.
Okay, Einar Tangen, now that Donald Trump is back in the White House, we are seeing the very strong isolationist posture that this government in Washington is taking right now. We see the United States withdraw from many international organizations, withdraw from its engagement with many other multinational institutions. I guess it's best summed up by, Trump's campaign slogan, America First. We also see the United States using tariffs as a tool of foreign policy. China, on the other hand, is trying to persuade people that they should go along the path of globalization and multilateralism. So where do you see this heading?
Well, there's a stark contrast, obviously, between the U.S. Trying to reassert some sort of unilateralism with or without the UN versus what Wang Yi was talking about. This is at this point, 80 years down a journey that the world has taken. The United States initially wanted to create a better world that was more multilateral, but now that it has arrived, the U.S. is balking. They say somehow that they have been a victim of these poor countries who can't feed themselves. It's unfortunate. So right now, Wang Yi is stressing that the world needs to come together. There needs to be a framework. China has suggested 3 principles about security, development, and respect for nations. These are the types of things that are necessary in a multipolar world, because with everybody oppressing their own issues, you have to have some idea that there is a base level. Otherwise, you can have chaos. And right now, the U.S. is pushing towards chaos. China is trying to create some sort of order within a much larger global community.
Brian Becker, there also appears to be a big difference in the fundamental foreign policy philosophies of the United States and of China. I mean, take the example that was mentioned by Foreign Minister Wang Yi at the United Nations. China is trying to seek peace in Gaza, in the West Bank, in Ukraine as well. It doesn't want the achievement of peace to be some kind of bargaining chip in some kind of business transaction, which we're seeing from Donald Trump. You know, he sees business opportunities in all these things. What do you make of that difference?
Yeah, it's fundamental. It's a fundamental difference. I mean, we have a lot to learn from the past 15 months as well. I mean, the United States tips its hat to multilateralism to the extent that it still is engaged in the UN. This was during the Biden administration, but it used its veto power as one of the permanent members of the Security Council to veto multiple times ceasefire resolutions for Gaza to end the genocide in Gaza, the mass killing spree by the U.S.-backed Israeli government. We see this over and over again, where the U.S. actually is premised, its policy is premised on might makes right. Remember, for all of us, when China had its revolution, the United States evicted the People's Republic of China for more than 20 years from the United Nations, all at the same time giving lip service to multilateralism in the world community and ending the scourge of war. I think also, if we're realistic, whenever the world turns against a U.S. act of military intervention or aggression like the Iraq War or the Yugoslav War, the U.S. basically turns its back on the United Nations and says, oh, we don't need the United Nations, we'll use NATO or some other sort of U.S.-led military alliance that will be a substitute for multilateralism. But I think what China's trying to do is say the world really could live together. It benefits from cooperation. Climate change by itself requires cooperation everywhere, including in the biggest economies. So that would mean the United States and China. Again, the United States is ripping up the tenets of the UN Charter, even as it still remains a member, withdrawing from the World Health Organization, defunding the UN Work and Relief Agency for Gaza, many other institutions as well as pulling out of the Paris Climate Treaty. So the U.S. is basically trashing the idea of multilateralism with the fantasy that the U.S. can be a unipolar power, but I don't think that will actually succeed. I think it is a fantasy.
And Brian, that belief that might is right, I mean, is that sustainable in the longer term? Because the world is changing. We see it happening right before us right now. We've seen what happened to the United States after its involvement in Iraq, in Syria, in Libya as well. Yeah,
it's a complete fantasy. I mean, it's playing with fire, actually. The might makes right. We saw that in Iraq. We saw that in Afghanistan. We saw that in Vietnam. We saw that in Korea. Right now, the situation is much more dangerous, in fact, because at least during the Cold War, when there was a socialist camp in the Soviet Union, and even though it was a bipolar world and very dangerous, at least there was the architecture of international arms agreements. But the Bush administration and the George W. Bush administration and later Obama and then Trump basically ripped up the architecture of international arms reduction agreement, such that it's now it's the wild, wild west, so to speak.
Okay, Einar Tangen, regarding the negotiations between the United States and Russia to bring the conflict in Ukraine to an end, Foreign Minister Wang Yi, he addressed that at the United Nations. This is some of what he had to say. Let's listen.
China welcomes all efforts dedicated to peace, including the recent consensus reached between the United States and Russia. At the same time, we believe that all parties involved, including those with a vested interest, should participate in the peace talks process at the appropriate time. This conflict is taking place on European soil, and Europe has an even greater responsibility to play an important role in this matter.
So that was the Foreign Minister talking at the Munich Security Conference, not at the UN. But what do you make of the fact that Ukraine and Europe have been sidelined from these negotiations?
Well, Frank, from a practical perspective, there can be no peace agreement that doesn't involve the parties. This is the same argument when the Ukraine tried to have a peace conference without Russia. It's pointless. You can maybe make some sort of grand gesture, but it's not going to work. What Wang Yi is pointing out is that a real solution has to be something that both parties agree to. And the other countries can simply be guarantors helping them, but they cannot, create the peace themselves and enforce it on other people. I mean, right now, as my previous colleague pointed out, we're returning to the law of the jungle. The UN was all about trying to create a global consensus where people wouldn't take unilateral actions. Where has it led us? Nearly 100 countries today are involved in conflicts and it's displaced 95 million people. And we're seeing the stress of that around the world. So clearly, there has to be either a call for a civilization, or we descend into chaos.
Zoon, of course, as I said, there is a widespread recognition that we live in a multipolar world right now. And we look at Trump's isolationist policies. There was a piece in Foreign Policy magazine which said that, you know, international organizations, institutions can survive Trump's policies by building alternative networks. These networks would involve things like think tanks, charities, including multinational corporations as well, as we see in some instances. Is that workable?
I think this piece may be underestimating the will and the resolve with which a vast majority of the world wants to continue with the UN system and the existing mechanisms. And I also think that parallel to the international organizations tied directly with the United Nations, we see a growing role and growing importance and expansion of other organizations. As I mentioned, the BRICS, SCO, we have China plus the Central Asian countries, many examples of regional and on a global level organizations that are making up for the limited representation in comparison with the need on the UN level as well. So I do believe that there is a vast recognition. I also agree with both of my co-panelists that we are moving towards at least a space in which the one most powerful country that had supported the idea of the UN, seeing itself at the top, sees itself not as a beneficiary, but as one that's being increasingly viewed as less relevant in some ways. And I'll also add that based on your previous questions, when the United States saw itself above the law regarding the war in Iraq, regarding so many other situations, the Paris Agreement on climate issues and so many others, at that time, the resistance to that was limited and regional. Today, it's more global. And with China's support, with the UN support, I believe that parallel organizations, but also evolution of the UN may be inevitable in the years to come.
Okay, and that's where we have to leave it. Zoon, Ahmed Khan, Brian Becker, and Einar Tangen, thanks for being with us. Now, earlier, my colleague Elaine Reyes spoke with the Hungarian Foreign Minister Peter Szijjarto about the current state of the world and geopolitical tensions.
The recent developments are pretty much favorable to us because the former US administration has carried out a political strategy which was based on interference into domestic issues of other countries, financed from here, from the United States, with billions of dollars, investing in sovereign countries in order to destabilize the political situation, in order to make the life of governments hard, you know, and now this is over. Since the new administration in the United States has cut the financial channels of all these interference activities, now I hope that the international liberal mainstream will be weakened so much that they will not be able to overrule the international politics. What I see is that in the recent years, the representatives of woke ideology and the representatives of the international mainstream have poisoned the international political life. They poisoned it because they have totally eliminated mutual respect. And instead of mutual respect, we've seen blackmailing, we've seen unlimited criticism, we've seen judging, we've seen stigmatizing others, which is totally unacceptable. And with this approach, actually, the recent years have become the age of dangers because there was an inability in the international community to resolve the conflicts. Why? Because if there's no common sense, if there's no mutual respect, then solving complicated issues is pretty impossible.
So how do you see that happening, given what you just said? Organizations like the United Nations meeting the needs, evolving to meet the needs of what's happening around the world?
The United Nations failed to become a platform for peace under the very challenging security circumstances in the recent years. The United Nations was unable to contribute to creating peace in areas of the world where significant security-related challenges have popped up. So, therefore, I think now the leaders of the United Nations must get out of their comfort zone, must get out of the ivory tower, and initiate and carry out such innovative reforms which would be able to convince the most important stakeholders of global politics that UN can definitely play a role. And if this is the case, then the UN, I think, could be able to adopt or adjust itself to these new circumstances and could become relatively successful as well.
Now, Hungary held the presidency of the Council of the European Union during the second half of last year. So given all of the challenges that we're seeing geopolitically, what is your assessment right now of the European Union?
Well, I have to tell you that the European Union is a crisis. It's in a security crisis, political crisis, and economic crisis as well. Why I mean that? Because the European Union has been losing a lot of its competitiveness. The United States is increasing the gap between, China is taking over, and the European Union is just losing competitiveness. Why that happens? Because of over-ideologizing the economic issues, because of very aggressive political ideologies, because very high energy prices. And the European Commission proved to be unable to handle these challenges. When it comes to security, the war has been going on in the heart of Europe for 3 years now. And the European Union, instead of isolating the conflict, globalize the conflict, instead of cooling down the tension, has basically encouraged, by putting oil on the fire. And when it comes to political crisis, I mean, the institutions of European Union are not taken seriously by any external factors. The two strongest countries of the European Union are witnessing governmental crisis at the same time. So therefore I say that the debate about the future is Europe is now being on a clean track. Because in this debate, there are federalists and sovereignists debating each other, how Europe should look like. Federalists say that it should be a federalistic superstate. We, the sovereignists, say that no, this should be an integration of sovereign and strong countries. And I think that time has proven that those solutions, which have been based on an intergovernmental cooperation or based on member states' competencies, have worked out much better than those which were based on, Brussels kind of solutions.
You touched on this, but Minister, let's turn to what has been happening in Ukraine now. And your country has done a lot to try to bring this situation to an end. What do you make of your country's efforts, and what is happening as we speak with other countries, the United States, Russia, also trying to work to bring this to an end?
Well, I'm pretty sure that this whole thing can be solved exclusively with a Russian-American agreement. Therefore, we are happy that these Russian-American talks have been started. Generally speaking, in case there's a good cooperation between Russia and the United States, it's good for the world as well, from security perspective for sure. Plus, we do believe that based on the Russian-American agreement, the whole war in Ukraine can be resolved. Therefore, we were happy with President Trump winning the elections because the former US administration was very much pro-war. Similarly to the European politicians, they were pretty much pro-war. So therefore we do count on the common sense of the current US administration. We count on the success of the negotiations between the Americans and the Russians, because it has been proven during the last 3 years, which we have been saying for 3 years and for which we have been under attack tremendously, that there's no solution on the battlefield. The only solution is around the negotiating table. And the channels of communication must be kept open, and diplomacy must take over from weapons.
Your country, Hungary and China, have very long ties. Both sides elevated ties to an all-weather comprehensive strategic partnership. In 2023, almost half of all Chinese foreign direct investment in Europe went to Hungary. How important is China-Hungary economic ties?
Look, we have taken a lot of profit out of this highly developed Hungarian-Chinese economic cooperation, and I do believe that it's based on mutual benefits. So Chinese companies have been the biggest investors in Hungary in 2020, in 2023, and 2024. So 3 out of the last 5 years. China is the number 2 import source for the Hungarian economy. Our trade has gone beyond $10 billion basically every year. The biggest ever greenfield investment in the history of Hungary is carried out by a Chinese company. And we became a hub of the Chinese investments in Europe when it comes to the electromobility. And we all know that, that the transformation of the automotive industry to electric basis is the backbone of the European economy and will be decisive from the perspective of the future growth path of the European economy. On top of that, we export the most food to China from Central Europe. We are having the most flights with China, 21 a week to 7 major Chinese cities. The guest nights of the Chinese tourists in Hungary has exceeded 500,000 last year, which is another record. BYD is building its first ever European factory. CATL is building a huge factory in Hungary. Huawei Cobalt, so many Chinese companies. So if we had not cooperated with China on economic field, if we had adjusted ourselves with this liberal mainstream policies of the European Union aiming at de-risking and decoupling, we would have lost a lot. We would have lost a lot. So the Hungarian-Chinese cooperation has a great contribution to the economic success of Hungary.
Minister Peter Szijjarto, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, I appreciate it.
And that is where we need to leave it. My thanks to my colleague Elaine Bress for her interview with the Hungarian Foreign Minister. I'm Ahmed in Washington.